Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about, without a doubt, one of the things that, at least during my career, changed policing. Without a doubt, policing and the things that the police officers in the United States did, the investigators, the investigations that we put together, things changed as a result of terrorism. So we're going to talk a little bit about terrorism. It's a controversial topic. I'll try and avoid those topics. I think we can all agree that as we discuss being an investigator, being a detective, criminal justice in the United States in general, that we all agree that if we could prevent something from happening, prevent someone from being a victim, that would be the best outcome. As you can see at this point in the course, most of what investigators do, whether it's at the federal level, state level, is reactive. We're reactive. Someone's been hurt. We come in and we try and do the best that we can to make the victim whole again, and try and recover some of the losses if it's a property crime. But we're reactive in nature. Without a doubt, I hope that as investigators we get better at trying to stop these events from happening. So although there's a lot of political statements being made about this or about that, I think we all agree that if we can come up with ideas to prevent some of this from happening, it would be the best outcome for everybody. So let's just kind of jump into it. For this purpose of this class, and we teach a whole course on terrorism, but understand for the purpose of this class that terrorism, as defined by the FBI and the Terrorism Research Center, is the idea that force or violence is used against a person or property in the idea with this intent to coerce somebody, to scare somebody. This idea typically falls under the category that it's state-sponsored, a government sponsors this, or a religious group is sponsoring this. So certainly state-sponsored violence against people to scare them into change, whether it's the government change or just citizens to change. Certainly we define it that it's a state involvement or religious involvement. But don't forget, there are a lot of criminal organizations that have nothing other than criminal intent involved. So certainly if you see a test question, terrorism can be defined by, yes, state sponsored acts to coerce, religious things that are done to coerce, and then criminal activities that are done to coerce. Remember that key factor is that the intent is to coerce, to scare a group into changing or a government into changing. Understand the policing changed as a result of this. We now expect local, state law enforcement to be involved with the federal government to help us in the task against terrorism. A couple of myths to dispel at this point. As much as we talk, and we're going to talk about the two levels of terrorism, we talk about international terrorism, we're going to talk about domestic terrorism, meaning that someone within our borders committed this act. Understand that the majority of all terrorism is domestic. We see movies and we talk a lot about, certainly 9/11. That changed a lot of the way we do policing in the United States. So international terrorism is there, but domestic terrorism is absolutely what's occurring most within our borders. And we'll discuss those levels of domestic terrorism. But understand, and if you see a test question, domestic terrorism certainly accounts for the majority of what we do. Certainly we see in the news lately that there are certain actors that commit these acts of terrorism that we call lone wolf, where they were acting by themselves. There was no state involvement, no government behind them that we're aware of. There's no religious group behind them that we're aware of. So understand, these individuals are very, very difficult to predict, very difficult to identify. So again, if you see a test question, lone wolf terrorism committed by a single individual, they're not easy to understand. We might not ever come up with a motive for it, but they're hard to predict. simply just being weird. We see all over the TV when one of these acts happen, whether we have an active shooter in the school, whether we have an attempt on a ex-president, his life, trying to figure out why. We might not ever understand why. So the lone wolf person that's acting by themselves, very, very difficult to investigate and to find motives many times. So remember, the thing that I want to try and break you away from is, does international terrorism exist? Absolutely. We see a lot of movies, we see a lot of things, 9/11, we attribute a lot of this international terrorism, and your book portrays it that way. I don't necessarily agree with the way the book has presented it. It's a little old, outdated. But when we say, are there Islamic extremists? Absolutely. Are there Christian extremists? Absolutely. So don't get caught up in the religious side of it being one certainly outweighing the other. In fact, if we look at victimizations, we can certainly state, and we've got it on record as far as putting numbers together, that Muslims constitute the majority of international terrorisms that are committed upon the Muslim people. So they are highly recognized as victims in this. So just understand that there can be extremists on either side in any religion. It's a lot more complicated than maybe the text presents it, but just keep in mind that there are many different motivations out there. A lot of it's state-sponsored, a government behind the individual or group, or religious motivations, and then the criminal motivations. The FBI does characterize terrorism certainly into international and domestic. So if you see a test question based on that, certainly that's the way the federal government defines it. They certainly define it under what we call Martin's 5 motivations to commit these acts. Certainly state-sponsored, religious, criminal are in those 5 motivational reasons for why somebody would do this. So keep that as we start to talk about this behind, understand that. When we talk about domestic terrorism, I want you to read the chapter. There's a lot of important information about recognized groups that have presented themselves to do terrorism around the world within the borders of the United States. But when we talk about, domestic terrorism, falls under many categories. We certainly hear a lot about white supremacists, black supremacists. We hear a lot about right-wing extremists. We also hear about left or environmental extremists. So there are many, many different extremists within organizations that can perform that act of terrorism within our borders. And let's not forget the one that happens with heavy frequency is active shooters within our schools, our restaurants, our movie theaters. And this is something that really is starting to become more prevalent in society. So trying to figure out ways to stop this, whole nother course. Just understand, as an investigator, these are things we are going to have to look into. Motivations, without a doubt. One of the huge things that we don't see a lot in the news is the idea that terrorism is not just about violent bombings and guns. Certainly that's there. But the technology that we expect in our lives, certainly there are groups out there will try and go in and disrupt that technology. From my hometown in Vegas, we saw it within our casinos. We've seen it within dealerships and vehicle dealerships being disrupted, power grids being disrupted based on attacking that technology. So that's there. Read through the chapters and get an understanding, after you've been on the websites, of all the multitude of different organizations that are out there that we're aware of. Certainly there's going to be others that we're not aware of, that we haven't identified yet, but they basically have the same desire. They're trying to affect change. These individuals do not believe that they can change the way the governments and people operate in the way that we expect through the rule of law. So their whole idea is to do things that are so destructive that it'll in effect cause a change within the governments and within life in general, if it's religious or whether it's state-sponsored. So our response to terrorism really has changed. At the beginning of my career, we really let the federal government deal with the huge problem of terrorism. But as we started to see after 9/11, international terrorism, and with the amount of active shooters, state and local investigators and law enforcement, they need to be involved. With the attempted assassination, you can see on our ex-president that the state and local government needs to be better to work with the federal government, build that cooperation together to go after these investigative techniques. You know, it's one thing to investigate after the fact, whole nother one to try and prevent it from ever happening, which is what we're going to be talking about or reading about in your next chapter, which is really the case prep, trying to organize the case, put it through the court system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. If this is your dream job and you're going to be getting involved into the court system as an investigator with the federal government and state government, we have lots of courses that we teach that will specifically address what happens in that courtroom. As you read through the chapter on case preparation, understand there are a lot of steps at play here. For purposes of the test, and it's one of those things that I always get beat up on because I don't address it a lot. I'm not going to argue whether it's good or bad, but the system of justice that we have in the United States and how we present criminal cases in front of a court, understand 90 to 95% of those cases are what we call a plea bargain, where both sides get together, they negotiate, try and save time in the courts, trying to alleviate the pain that the victims might have to go through by going to court. So they come to an agreement without ever going through the court process. This is called a plea agreement or plea arrangement. And the huge portion of what happens in the United States criminal justice system is handled in that arrangement situation at about 90 to 95% of the time. The way it proceeds, or the criminal case proceeds in the court, again, very confusing. But just understand, when someone is arrested in the United States, we bring them in front of a magistrate. At this point in time, in front of this magistrate, this pre-trial, we first inform the individual of the charges formally of what they're being held for. So the first time that we formally charge somebody or let them be aware of what is at this pre-trial stage, you know, going on to having an arraignment is going to be the next stage. This arraignment idea is where the government or law enforcement, you as the investigator, will put your probable cause in front of the magistrate, in front of a jury, to see if they agree that you had facts and circumstances to take somebody's freedom and liberty. And is there sufficient evidence to show that they committed an act against criminal statutes? So we have to prove in court that we had probable cause, and that there is a statute that says directly you're not allowed to do this. So that whole thing happens from the beginning of the pretrial to the arraignment, and then on throughout the actual trial, and then on to sentencing, where the magistrate, judge, or the jury, depending on the state, will decide the punishment with regards to the crime that was committed. You know, one of the quiz questions will talk about defenses that some of the pretrial detainees or the accused will come up with. Certainly when we hear the term alibi, you know, we see it all over TV. That typically just means they're innocent. They didn't do it. There's complete evidence to support that they could not have done this crime. They have an alibi. A little bit different than an excuse. Many defendants will have an excuse. What that means is they're going to try and present that they didn't have a criminal intent. They weren't trying to criminally do anything. So their intent was not criminal, therefore they have an excuse. That's kind of what the idea of an excuse is. You know, and then as we go on and we see all the things happening within the trials, because there's a lot of trials going on in the news, and we see that we start to seat the jurors, people that are going to listen to the evidence presented in court. Jurors are selected, very lengthy process, and during that process, there are times that, depending on the state law, that both sides, the prosecution and the defense, can have someone eliminated for consideration just because for some reason, they don't feel good about this person. But in most states, that if we use what's called challenge for cause on top of the idea of just a couple of those that you just don't want, challenge for cause means you're going to have to show that there's some reason, a specific reason, that this person cannot be fair to my client, or that this person will not do the task that we're asking them to do. So we have to show that they're not capable of doing what we're asking them to do. So that's the whole idea of this challenge for cause. So read both the chapters. Look at how we present the case once we've done all the investigative natures. Read the chapter, lengthy chapter on Homeland Security and terrorism. It's a big deal. It's a huge thing, and it has to be addressed, because until we start addressing some of these ways that as investigators, and they're very, very political, I'm not going to get into it. The whole idea of the Patriot Act, the USA Patriot Act, as it was implemented after 9/11, certainly gave investigators, law enforcement, people like myself, a lot more power to go out there and try and identify the people that committed these horrific acts. Has it been an intrusion upon the constitutional rights? Some would argue absolutely. That's going to be politically settled in courts. We won't get into it at this point. But as you read through the chapter, I want you to be thinking about the Fourth Amendment. We've discussed that previously. And how does this apply with regards to investigators with the new power of the Patriot Act in trying to go out and put a case together about people that really are just there to try and coerce individuals into changing. So a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to read. Hope you're having fun at this point. See you next time.